When it comes to conversations about Mary, especially between Protestants and Catholics and Orthodox, I think one of the biggest issues right now is that a lot of times we're not actually disagreeing in the way that we think we are. Like, I understand in the moment, it feels like we're seriously disagreeing. We're seriously kind of just butting heads and going at it. And a lot of times we actually are. But I feel like in other situations, particularly in situations like this one, if you actually slow down the conversation long enough and really begin to examine what's being said by both parties, you'll quickly start to realize that we're often just talking right past each other. And I think that's a problem. And look, I get how that happens. From the Catholic and Orthodox perspective, if I could put myself in y'all's shoes, and see from y'all vantage point, I feel like probably a lot of times what y'all are probably seeing is just a bunch of Protestants pushing back on certain Marian doctrines or certain ways that your church traditions have historically spoke about Mary. And you kind of come to the conclusion, you feel like you have no other choice but to come to this conclusion that, maybe you guys just don't honor Mary at all. Like, is that what it is? Maybe you guys just don't love Mary the way that you should love Mary. And that's where I think a lot of these conversations really start to break down because, from a Protestant perspective, that's not at all what's happening from our vantage point. You see, for us, if I can ask my Catholic brothers and sisters to put on the Protestant lens for a moment, it's not that we don't honor Mary. Of course we honor Mary. We love Mary. But rather it's just that we're trying to be careful about how far we go in that honor. And those are two totally different things. And I think that distinction matters because if you miss that, then every disagreement that we're going to have in this conversation is just going to boil down to character assassination instead of really focusing on the theological matters at hand. Because now it's no longer about what Scripture actually teaches about Mary. Now it's about whether or not someone, loves Mary enough or has enough devotion for Mary or whatever the case may be. And I just don't think that's a helpful way to move this and really push this conversation forward. Because a lot of the time, these conversations just shut down the real engagement that really needs to happen before it even begins. And so look, what I want to do in this video is just kind of hit a reset button on this conversation a bit. And I just want us to ask the more precise question, right? I don't want us to get caught up in trying to answer the question, how important is Mary or how much love should we show to Mary? All those questions are very important. But I think there's a more precise question that we can get to because I think all Christians across the board can agree that Mary is important, that she should be loved, that she should be honored, all those good things. But rather, I think the more important question is this: what are we actually allowed to say about Mary based on Scripture? And more importantly, when we start seeing these typological connections in the Bible, when we start noticing patterns and parallels, how far are we allowed to take those? I think those two questions are the more important questions for the sake of this conversation, because that's really where a lot of tension lies, if we're being honest, right? It's not just about Mary per se. I think it's about interpretation. It's about what counts as a valid typological connection. And then beyond that, what counts as a valid conclusion drawn from that typological connection. And so I think it's when we get clarity there, we're going to keep running into this same wall over and over and over again. And I don't know about you, but I'm tired of getting my head bashed in these conversations. I really want to push this conversation forward. And so that's why I think this conversation about Mary being connected to the Ark of the Covenant is actually just a really good place for us to try to, gain some meaningful ground. Because I think what you're going to see is that both sides can actually agree on a lot more than they think. But the real question is what each side is going to do with that agreement. I mean, that really is the heart of this whole thing. And so for those who are kind of new to this whole conversation about Mary and the Ark of the Covenant, let's start tracing out where exactly we agree. Again, for those who are new, because I find this part to be really fascinating. You see, I think at the very least, we should all be able to acknowledge that there is a real connection here between Mary and the Ark of the Covenant. I mean, you can see it pretty clearly in Scripture. For example, if you look at 2 Samuel chapter 6, verse 9 through 16, you'll see that, in that account, that David rejoiced as the Ark of the Covenant is being brought back to Israel. And there's this deep sense of awe, this sense of celebration. And it's because David rightly understands the gravity of that moment, right? He understands what the presence of the Ark of the Covenant represents, in redemptive historical history, in historical context. And so it's that weight that leads him to say, who am I that the Ark of the Lord should come to me? And look, every time that I read that passage, you could almost feel the emotion behind those words just coming out of the page. The Bible really is that exciting to read if you just take some time to just slow down and read it. Go on to the beach, watch the sunset come up, and then get lost in the story of the Bible. Don't read it just like any other book, because it's not just any other book, but it really does come to life if you have eyes to see and ears to hear what it has to say. But going back to our conversation at hand, honestly, that account is already fascinating on its own. But I think it becomes even more fascinating when you just turn over to Luke chapter 1, specifically in that visitation portion of that chapter, because now you start to see something very familiar start to happen, right? When Mary comes to Elizabeth, Elizabeth responds by saying, "Why is this granted to me that the mother of my Lord should come to me?" And of course, at the same time, John the Baptist leaps in her womb in the presence of Jesus. And so if you're paying attention, which I hope I haven't lost you at this point in the video, you'll start to notice these overlapping things, these themes of rejoicing, of the feeling of unworthiness, the presence of something sacred, something covenantal coming near. And again, none of this is meant to be random, right? Luke is very intentional in how he's writing, right? And Jewish writers, just in particular, this is just food for thought for people who are, maybe new to Christianity. Jewish readers in particular would have been very familiar with these kinds of patterns that he's drawing, right? These aren't just throwaway details that Luke is giving us. And there's a principle in that, because whenever scripture makes connection like these, it's doing it for a reason. It's doing it with a purpose. And we have to recognize that reason and recognize that purpose. Now, what makes this even more compelling, in my opinion, is when you pair, that reality, that visual that we're getting, that parallel that we're seeing, with the function of the ark itself. Again, this is where it gets even more interesting, because the Ark of the Covenant carried, the Old Covenant, most notably the tablets of the law. And in Exodus chapter 34, verse 28, don't know how many people are familiar with this passage, we're told that the Ten Commandments are the words of the covenant. And so when we understand that rightly, the Ark isn't just carrying a couple of important relics, but rather it's carrying the very thing that represents God's covenant with his people. But then when you move a little forward in scripture, you start to see something even greater starting to take shape, which is that in Isaiah chapter 42, verse 6, and Isaiah 49, verse 8, we're told that the servant will be given as the covenant. I wonder how many Christians are familiar with this passage. And of course, as Christians, historically, we understood that to be referring to Jesus, which means that when Mary is carrying Jesus in her womb, she's carrying the new covenant himself. And so when you bring all of that together, I think we can at least say this much. Just as the ark carried the old covenant, Mary carried the new covenant. And again, I think we can all agree that that's a real meaningful parallel that scripture has given us. And this is where I think, as Protestants, because I know some Protestants, they're kind of like, a little standoffish with a lot of these Mary typological connections. And, some of them are kind of like too cautious for their own good. I think if we're being careful and consistent here, we should be willing to acknowledge this. Like, yeah, there's something here. Even though scripture doesn't put a formal label on it in the way that Paul explicitly, puts a formal label on Christ being the new Adam, we can still recognize this reality as a valid typological pattern that we see in scripture. Because the Bible does this in other places too. I don't know many people know this, right? For example, take the idea of Jesus being the true Israel, right? Again, this is something that every Christian tradition kind of affirms. But one thing to note here is that you're not going to find a verse that just comes out and says explicitly or directly that Jesus is new Israel. But rather, what you're going to see is it clearly walk us through the logic of it in Scripture, kind of like how Scripture clearly walks us through the logic of the Trinity in Scripture. For example, in Hosea chapter 11, verse 1, Israel is called God's son coming out of Egypt. And then in Matthew chapter 2, verse 15, we see that exact same language is applied to Jesus. Or think about the wilderness account, right? Love it for both of these situations, right? Israel is tested for 40 years, obviously in the wilderness, and they fail miserably. But we shouldn't be too hard on them, because if we was in the same exact situation, we would fail too. Like, Israel is meant to kind of be that human representation of this is us. But as you continue to move on in redemptive history, in Matthew chapter 4, Jesus is tested for 40 days, and he, of course, succeeds. And even in, again, Isaiah 49, the servant is called Israel and yet also stands in the place of Israel to restore it. And so if we're willing to recognize that in the case of Jesus being the new Israel, if we're willing to grant that this is a valid typological connection, and that this is a language that we are okay with using, then we should also be willing to say that this connection between Mary and the Ark of the Covenant is a real and valid typological connection based on the same principles that we already use for Jesus being the new Israel. Of course, as we kind of trace through the Bible. And so now that we've established where we do agree, I think the question that we now have to wrestle with is this: what are we actually allowed to build from this connection, from this agreement? Now, it's really important that we take our time in answering that, because this is honestly where a lot of the tension between Protestants and Catholics and Orthodox actually comes from. And so we can't rush past this, because there is a difference, an important difference at that, between recognizing a pattern in Scripture and then turning that pattern into a foundation, into a fountain of multiple other doctrines, right? Because those are not the same thing. One is an observation. The other is a conclusion. And I think if we don't keep those categories clear and separate, we can, almost unintentionally end up moving further than the text itself actually allows us to go. And so when we look at Mary in relation to, the Ark of the Covenant, I think what we can safely conclude from this connection is that she carried Christ, right? That she carried the one who is himself the new covenant, right? Just as the Ark carried the old covenant, right? That's, I think, what we can safely conclude. Now, I already know for a lot of my Catholic and Orthodox friends out there, and maybe some even Protestants, that might not seem like a lot. But I want you to know that even that one detail carries massive significance, right? And it's definitely not something that we should dare to downplay or ignore or treat like, oh, is that it? Like, what do you mean, is that it? That's really massive. But at the same time, I think we also have to ask ourselves, what does Scripture do with that typological connection after the fact? Because that's just as important in this conversation. And I think as we keep reading, what we'll notice is that Scripture doesn't actually develop that typology any further beyond that connection, right? Rather, what it shows us is that Mary carried Christ for a specific moment in redemptive history. And although that role is real, although that role is significant, although that role should not be downplayed, it was also temporary. Because once Christ was born, once his ministry began, once he grew into the role that he came to fulfill, we don't see the Bible continuing to build on that, arc connection in any kind of theological or doctrinal way. And I think that matters, because if that connection was meant to, carry some kind of ongoing theological weight that we're supposed to like hone in on, if it was meant to inform how we relate to Christ today, or how we access him, or how we understand Mary's role in the life of the believer, then you would kind of expect to see that development somewhere, anywhere in the New Testament. You would at least expect the apostles to kind of pick it up and to explain it and to apply it. But that's just the thing. We don't see that. And I don't think that absence is accidental, because again, that's how Catholics articulate Mary's role, right, in our redemption, is very, very important. So you would kind of think, well, do the apostles ever mention this? Because this is a big deal. But they don't. And again, I think that's a reason for that. And so I think it's at this point, our best course of action is to be careful. Is to stop where scripture stops, because any further development no longer becomes about recognizing what the text shows. Now it becomes about, extending it beyond what the text actually says. And I think that's kind of dangerous. And that's where, again, I'm trying to get my Catholics to understand this from a Protestant perspective. That's where historically Protestants tend to draw that line. And I would argue it's for a good reason. Because if the claim is simply this, that there is a meaningful parallel between Mary and Ark in that moment in Luke chapter 1, then look, we can all come together, sing Kumbaya, because we're all in agreement that there is a connection there. But if the claim becomes that therefore, because there's a connection, therefore Mary continues to play a unique, ongoing role in how believers relate to Christ, then at that point, we've completely moved beyond the text and moved towards a completely different category. Because now we're no longer dealing with, the observation of Luke chapter 1. Now we're dealing with, later theological construction. And, at that point, I think we have to ask yet another question, which is, where is that coming from? What is the basis for that kind of doctrinal development? Because it's certainly not something that Luke chapter 1 by itself actually gets you to, actually establishes. And so where's it coming from, right? And so here's where everything, for me, really comes to comes to fruition. Because again, from a Protestant perspective, we agree. And I want to stress this because this is really, really important. We agree that we're seeing the same valid typological connection. But then it's like we're watching that connection just get pulled in all kinds of different ways and in all kinds of different directions, right? It's being used to support ideas about Mary's sinlessness or her immaculate conception or the veneration of Mary and so on and so forth. And so from our side, from our vantage point, we're kind of just sitting there like, wait, hold on. What are we doing? How did we get here? Right? How are you getting all of that from this passage? Right? Am I reading the same passage? I know I just read it, like, it's only a couple of sentences. How do you get all of that from there? And, I think if you're a Catholic and Orthodox and you really want to push the conversation forward, and you're being intellectually honest, which is really important, I think you have to understand that that's a very fair and valid concern and question from our Protestant brothers and sisters, right? Because we're not doing this because we're trying to dismiss Mary, God forbid, right? And it's not because we're trying to avoid honoring her. Again, as Protestants, we love Mary. Of course we honor her, right? She's the mother of Jesus. But You see, it's because we don't believe Christianity operates without any type of guardrails. It's because we understand that doctrines have boundaries. And again, I actually think Catholics, Orthodox, Protestants, we all agree with that. We all agree that Christianity has boundaries and doctrines have boundaries. And so we all agree to that in principle. And so if we all agree to that in principle, and if that's the case, which I hope it is, then I think it's not only appropriate, but it's absolutely necessary for us to ask ourselves, where are those guardrails? Where are those boundaries? Where is the line in the sand that tells us, okay, we can affirm this, but no further? Because I think without that, it really becomes very difficult to explain why one inference is binding and another one isn't. I mean, this is exactly what I was getting at in my Mary Eve video. You know, the video where I talked about and evaluated whether or not Mary is the new Eve. And one of the things I asked in that video is why Mary and Eve and not Mary and Sarah or Mary and Hannah? Because Sarah and Hannah kind of have a typological connection with Mary. They both were promised that they would bear a son, even though they were Sarah was of old age and Hannah was barren. And so these are miracles, right? Mary conception was a miracle because she was a virgin. You know what I mean? So like there's connections that can be made there. And yet really the Catholic and Orthodox Church says, you know, yes to the Mary Eve one, not so much to the Mary and Sarah, Mary and Hannah. But my thing is like, okay, what's the difference? What is the criterion that you're using? Right? What is the guardrails that you're using? What is the boundaries that you're using to say yes to one and no to the other? Right? This is the question that is underneath the question. It's about the stopping point. And so this is where I think it's going to be extremely helpful to just be honest about the difference in how we're approaching scripture. Because again, from a Protestant perspective, all we're trying to do is operate within this principle, which is that scripture sets both the starting point and the stopping point. In other words, we believe it doesn't just give us the data that we are to operate from, but it also gives us the direction that we are to follow with that data, right? Or to put it another way, it doesn't just show us connections. It doesn't just show us different typological patterns and connections in scripture, but it also shows us how far we can take those typological patterns and connections, and how far those things are meant to go. But if we look at the alternative approach, and this is where, again, I think the real tension starts to come in. It seems to be that scripture gives us the starting point. I think we both agree on that. But then something else determines how far we can take it. And from our perspective, that's where things started to feel a little bit unclear, because now we're like, okay, so what does that mean? You know, now the question becomes, what is that something else? And ultimately, what is it grounded in? Again, totally valid questions. Now, to be clear, we're not saying that you can't make inferences, because I want to make that very clear. I don't want you to hear what I'm not saying. Of course, we can make inferences. We all do make inferences whenever we read the Bible. But I think we would all agree that there's a difference between making a valid inference and an invalid one. And so the question becomes, what actually makes that distinction? What makes an inference valid or invalid? Is it simply that the church has defined it that way? The church has said, okay, this is a valid inference and this is not a valid inference. Is that it? Or is it that scripture gives us the guardrails, the boundaries for how certain connections are meant to be understood? Or, you know, is that the case? Because when you look at how typology works elsewhere in scripture, you don't just see connections being made, but you also see the development of that connections, the boundaries, the guardrails of that connection. So you see explanation, you see repetition. For instance, take the connection between Adam and Christ as an example. That's something that we're not left to piece together on our own. It is explicitly taught and developed for our sake. Or you can even take the better parallel to this Mary arc typology, which is that Jesus is the true Israel. Again, we already covered this, right? That pattern is reinforced across multiple passages in a way that can give you confidence about what Scripture is actually doing. Again, that too has set the guardrails and boundaries for how we understand it. It doesn't leave us guessing. We're not just like, oh, well, maybe we can build this doctrine or that doctrine. It's like, no, it clearly puts the line in the sand of like, okay, this is what we mean by this. And so when it comes to Mary and the ark, we see the connection. Again, we all agree on this, but we don't see that same level of development as we do with, let's say, Jesus being the new Israel. And I don't think that's on accident. Because if this connection was meant to support the broader doctrinal claims about Mary that the Catholic and Orthodox Church is kind of postulating, is kind of putting forward, if it was meant to inform how we relate to Christ today, then I think it's completely reasonable that we would expect to see the apostles pick it up, explain it, and apply it. But again, we do not see that. And so that brings us to the million-dollar question. What exactly is authorizing the conclusions here? Again, not just the connection, but the conclusions themselves. Because this isn't just a small issue. We're not just talking about interesting theological ideas. We're talking about doctrines that in the Catholic and Orthodox traditions are being treated as binding on the conscience of every believer. Right? People are really dealing with real anxiety because they feel like if they reject this belief, right, that they're going to be considered outside of the church, that they're going to be considered anathematized. And so if that's the stakes, then I think it's on all of us. I think it's incumbent on all of us to try to get this right. And so again, from our perspective as Protestants, all we're trying to do is something very simple. We're not trying to deny any connections that the Scripture clearly presents. And we're not trying to minimize the role that Mary plays in redemptive history. Again, God forbid. But at the same time, we are trying to be as careful as possible not to build beyond what Scripture itself builds. Because we understand that the implications of getting that wrong are far too significant. And so we're trying to let Scripture set the boundaries, set the guardrails for both the starting point and the end point. Okay. And I think if we can at least agree on that principle, then I think we can start having a much more productive conversation going forward. And I will even throw this out there again, from my Protestant and Catholics brothers and sisters, because I know some of you are probably going to say, well, you're imposing sola scriptura on us, Janai, and we reject that. We believe sola scriptura and tradition. And it's like, you know what? Okay, fair enough. We'll go to your playing field. One, I want to see where we see in Scripture that it's developing all those doctrines, because that still has to be demonstrated. But two, show me where in your tradition, right? Not just in your ecumenical councils, right? But within the early church, show me where people are, where Irenaeus or where Tertullian, where Justin Martyr, where Polycarp, show me where these men who are very close, although centuries removed, it kind of gets a little dicey because 100 years is still 100 years. But neither here nor there. Tell me where you see them arguing that these later doctrines that, you're anathematized if you reject, these later dogmas are considered to be taught from the apostles themselves. If you can show me that, right, I think we'll at least have, again, a better conversation going forward. But if you can't show me that, if the only time that this claim is being put forward is 500, 800, 1500, 1600, 1900 centuries later, then I'm like, what do you expect me to do with that? Right? You're like, oh, just trust the church. This is 1900 years later. or 1500 years later or 700 years later. Like, I can't just be putting my my life on that. We have to, if we're going to have meaningful conversations, we cannot just assert these things. We have to demonstrate them. We're saying that scripture is giving us the guardrails and boundaries for how we make these typological or draw these conclusions from these typological connections. If you say that that's not the move, then show me a better one. But all right, guys, that's the video. If you like this video, please go ahead and like, share, subscribe, do all that good stuff. It really does help the channel out a lot. But until next time, guys, peace.